Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, last week I talked about how William McKinley was very pro-annexation of other countries, but his predecessor, Grover Cleveland, was not very approving of overthrowing other countries and making them American. When Hawaii was almost going to become American, maybe, sorta, Grover Cleveland was like, no, how on earth can we have Hawaii join the United States, and was very against it. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 1840s and 1850s was a really bad time to be a president because you were going to be very unpopular, and throughout those 2 decades, no American president was re-elected at all. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, Woodrow Wilson was a president, and he wasn't exactly a great president, but he was probably a dyslexic president. And we know this because he always had a tough time reading when he was a kid. He always had a tough time with those kind of skills, so most likely he was dyslexic, but in the 1800s exactly, nobody cares if you're dyslexic, so they're not going to diagnose that. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, this is not really about a president, but more so all of the more recent presidents. And I say recent as in, like, since the 1800s, which is probably not that recent in American presidential history. But anyways, the windows at the White House, they cannot open. This is pretty obvious. It's for safety reasons. You can't really open the window because then someone's gonna shoot you. Maybe because, you know, they want to shoot the president nowadays. So yeah, the windows at the White House cannot open. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, President Dwight Eisenhower is the only president in American history to have balanced the budget all 8 years. And I think that's pretty impressive, although personally, if I was president, I think balancing the budget would be probably not my #1 thing that I would do. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, 1 year ago, I was very sick. On February 6, 2025, I was very sick, so I didn't make a video. But you know who was not very sick on February 6, 1952? Queen Elizabeth II. Well, at least I hope, because that was the day she was coronated as Queen of the United Kingdom. She actually got to visit the most amount of United States presidents in American history, even though Queen Victoria was the one who served alongside most of the American presidents. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Ulysses S. Grant was known to be drinking and smoking very weird things, but he drank red wine laced with cocaine as probably the weirdest thing he ever did. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, photographs haven't been around forever, and they definitely haven't been around forever in American history, but they were around in 1857. Now, what happened in 1857? Well, the 15th president of the United States, James Buchanan, was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1857, becoming the very first inauguration to be photographed. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President George W. Bush was known to be quite a very interesting character that served as president, but he was actually arrested for a DUI back in 1976, and it actually came up during his campaign as a potential issue for him. However, it didn't seem to matter because he did win the Electoral College. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, is known for saying, "You're fired," and he actually tried to trademark "you're fired," but of course, it didn't end up being successful, and he failed at trademarking that phrase. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On the 2nd of November, 1889, the United States got 2 new states, North and South Dakota. They're often called the Twin States because, you know, they were right next to each other. Benjamin Harrison signed the paperwork for those states to become states, but he mixed up the paperwork. He shuffled them intentionally so that nobody in the future could know which state came first. Although we genuinely associate North Dakota to have come first because N is before S in the alphabet. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, during the Civil War, there was actually a bunch of future presidents who served loyally for the Union Army. There was one glaring exception, though, Grover Cleveland. He didn't serve, period. He didn't serve at all. How did he do this? How did he avoid the draft? What he did was he actually paid an immigrant from Poland who apparently looked exactly like him to take his spot in the draft so that he could stay at home and not fight. In fact, Cleveland was also, as I've talked about before, the only Democrat in this span of presidents and Republican presidents. And of course, I'm not saying the Democratic Party back then is like the Democratic Party right now, but back then, the Democratic Party was evil and they were running some pretty unloyal people. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 3 million Epstein files were released, and President Donald Trump was named 38,000 times in the batches that have been released. He is named more times in the Epstein files than Jesus is in the Bible. It's absolutely despicable. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The most notable founding father, George Washington, is actually pretty closely related to one of the most important Confederate figures, Robert E. Lee. George Washington and Robert E. Lee are not completely strangers. George Washington was Robert E. Lee's step-great-grandfather-in-law to Robert E. Lee. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, died on the 31st of July in 1885, he requested that when he was buried a couple of days later, that he was actually not going to be buried in a casket or a coffin, as is normal. He was just going to be buried in the American flag itself with a copy of the Constitution underneath his head. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today in the United States of America is President's Day, and here in Canada, it's Family Day. So I'm gonna think that it's a little bit weird, but I think it makes sense to merge the two. So we're not actually gonna talk about a president today. We're gonna talk about the brother of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968, and the man who shot him, Sirhan Sirhan, is still alive and still in prison, having been denied parole 17 times. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 26th president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, was alive when World War I broke out, and he was in favor of not only the war itself, but serving in the war. And by the time it was 1914, Theodore Roosevelt was pushing 60. Like, how is he gonna fight in World War I? That's exactly what President Wilson was thinking when he rejected his application to serve in World War I. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to, and his son served in World War I, unfortunately died. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, right now it is apparently freezing rain, and it is not a very good day to be in Toronto. It would be a very good day to be in Toronto if I lived in the White House, but the White House isn't in Toronto, and I'm not the president of the United States. But the very first president of the United States to live in the White House and also have bowling was Harry Truman. I don't think that was my best way of integrating those two things, but I did want to tell you that it's freezing out here, and there's definitely something solid coming on my head right now, and I really don't like that. I would prefer to be bowling. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, right now, it just snowed yesterday in Toronto, so it's probably not a very good day to be a general in a war, because there's snow all over the place. Everyone's gonna hear you walking on the snow. And that's probably what Dwight Eisenhower must have thought, because even though he was one of the most famous generals in the United States Army, of course, later became president, that's why I'm talking about him, he never actually stepped foot on a battlefield at all. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, I'm not on any sports teams because I am not that athletic, but this is a soccer team hat for Toronto FC, which is the soccer team here in Toronto. And this relates because the 35th president, John F. Kennedy, didn't meet with a soccer team, but he was the very first United States president to meet with a winning sports team, being the basketball winners in 1963, the Boston Celtics. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your very quick presidential fact of the day, because I gotta go. 22nd and 24th president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, had a massive age difference with his wife, Frances. And this age gap was so massive, and because Cleveland was close friends with his wife's father, Cleveland himself, was the very first person to give Frances a baby carriage. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today, Canada lost the hockey at the Olympics, the men's hockey final, and the United States won. So I am very, very sad. But today is also George Washington's birthday. He turns the big 294. Hope you're having a great day, George. Anyways, when he was just 18, so a long, long time ago, he's 294 years old. When he was 18, he won the Virginia Collar and Elbow Wrestling Championship. So collar and elbows up championship, which I think is very, very interesting because I didn't even know what the heck that was 20 minutes ago. So happy birthday, George. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, on this day in 1848, 6th President John Quincy Adams died. He passed away on this day so many years ago. So it's fair to say that on this day, so many years ago, he probably wasn't seeing because he was dead. And he also wasn't seeing in 1791. And he was alive in 1791. What happened was that he was partially blinded looking at a solar eclipse. And I wish the weather was much better for me to look at a solar eclipse, but even when it was 2 years ago, the clouds were still here. So I was the only city that didn't see the solar eclipse. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, was known to be quite an interesting fellow. He had a button on his desk, not to nuke the entire world, but to just give him a fresca, which I think is pretty cool. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I'm here with my friend Josh. Joshua, what country are you from ethnically?
Philippines.
So the Philippines actually was colonized by the United States, and that's a very big no-go, right, Josh?
Yeah.
It was no good?
Yeah, no good.
Yeah, you can ask the Philippines, it was very no good. William McKinley was president during the Philippine-American War, and unfortunately there were a lot of bad things that happened in the Philippine-American War that was really bad for the Filipino people. And William McKinley actually didn't really know very much. At least we don't think he knew very, very much. But he did still continue on with the imperialistic war against the Philippines. And that's why this guy's here, right? That's why you're here in Canada, right? Or was it because of the Japanese? He doesn't know. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is Grand Canyon Day, which means on this day, all the way back in 1919, the Grand Canyon became an official landmark. And Theodore Roosevelt had actually died before that. He died in January of 1919, but he was instrumental in making the Grand Canyon like a thing. He was the one who signed the order to make the Grand Canyon a national monument. Hello, I'm Dezod 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Jimmy Carter is actually very, very unique. He was the very first president in American history to serve a full term, and during this full term, never appoint a single Supreme Court justice. Every other one that served a full term, because obviously William Henry Harrison didn't appoint any justices, but all the other ones that served at least one full term did appoint a Supreme Court justice up until Jimmy Carter, who didn't. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. This morning, President Donald Trump launched attacks on Iran in hopes of a regime change, a regime that came into power in the 1970s and the late 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president. And this Iran hostage crisis happened because, well, Iran had kidnapped American citizens living at the embassy in Iran. They kidnapped them and they took them as hostages. So that's how we get the Iran hostage crisis. And this lasts all the way until the 1980 presidential election. And Jimmy Carter was really tired of this because he was losing in the polls because of this crisis. And he lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. But that doesn't mean Jimmy Carter gave up. He worked tirelessly night in and day out throughout the rest of his presidency to get the hostages home. And the day before Ronald Reagan was sworn in on January 20th, 1981, Jimmy Carter had secured a deal to release the hostages.